hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my incredibly dull history series, and tonight we travel through time, meeting different royal figures from history and learning about their bedtime routines. We'll travel from ancient Egypt to ancient Rome, to Alexander the Great, all the way forward in time to Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II. I hope you find it so uninteresting that soon you will be asleep. Okay, let's do the relaxation session now, before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface you lie on tonight. And beneath all of that, feel the support of the earth. That deep, grounding support, that constant support, that unchanging, reassuring support that comes from our home, the earth. And as you become aware of it, see if you can release a little more. Let go a little more. 9. Feel into your body now. Where are you still holding? Where do you feel tension? Perhaps you feel pain. Maybe it's in your toes or your feet. Maybe it's in your lower legs. Maybe your thighs. Or your belly. Maybe you're holding in your chest. Or maybe you're like me and you hold too much tension in your hands or your face. And as you lie here now, and as you become aware of this tension or holding on, notice the release that comes with awareness. Just let go now. 8. You are safe. Allow my voice to be a friend tonight, to be a gentle guide. Know that my voice will only ever take you to safe places. See if you can find the peace in that fact. See if you can find the trust. See if you can notice that when we feel safe, we can become curious, and we can feel a little light of joy within our hearts as we move closer and closer to sleep. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, and whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts arrive with you tonight, just notice them for what they are. Thoughts, a part of being human, but not you. You are not your thoughts. You don't have to follow them. They don't have to lead your emotions. And so if and when they come, and they will, let them float away now, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing by through a starlit sky. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. Allow that fact to enable you to settle in now, to feel cozy now, to feel the warmth and joy of the ability to just lie here and hear a cozy story. 5. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It is just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. And so see if you can find that peace within you tonight. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things. The shelter you have tonight. The breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see ancient Egypt in all its ceremonial glory. For this is where our story will start, in a land long lost to time, far away from all that you know. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. And one, completely letting go now as I tell you tonight's sleep story. To begin any thorough exploration of royal bedtime routines, one must of course start in ancient Egypt, where sleep, like everything else in the life of a pharaoh, was less a private activity and more a ritualized demonstration of divine order. While records are incomplete, archaeological findings and funerary texts give us clues, often more about how royals slept in death than in life. But scholars have long suspected overlap. The pharaoh, seen not merely as a king, but as a living god, did not simply go to bed. He was put to bed, with a process likely to rival most modern weddings in complexity and staffing. It is generally accepted that the pharaoh's chambers were scented before his arrival, often using imported myrrh, frankincense, or in some cases, blue lotus oil. These weren't applied freely, but with precision, sometimes using alabaster spoons specifically carved for the purpose, each with a shallow scoop no larger than the pad of a royal finger. The application of scent alone could take upwards of 20 minutes, not including the preliminary incense offerings made by priests outside the sleeping quarters, a process necessary to appease the air, as one scribe put it. The royal bed itself was not designed for comfort in the modern sense. Typically raised on wooden legs, with lion paw feet, and sometimes sloping downward, so the pharaoh's head was higher than his feet. These beds were usually fitted with a curved headrest, made of stone or wood, and reportedly good for posture, but terrible for dreams. The use of linen was ubiquitous, but only a specific kind, woven tightly from flax that had to be harvested during the second lunar month, for reasons no one has properly explained. As for company, the pharaoh was rarely alone. Depending on the dynasty, he might be attended by fan-bearers, ointment boys, scribes to record dreams, and even a ceremonial harpist, whose only role was to strum a few reverent notes before the lights were dimmed, although in this case lights usually meant oil lamps, and dimmed meant slowly snuffed with a piece of woven reed dipped in damp clay. The act of extinguishing lamps was itself seen as a symbolic step, the world entering temporary death, while the pharaoh communed with the gods of sleep, or at the very least shut his eyes and hope for his throne not to be taken in his sleep. Finally, there was the matter of the royal amulets. These were selected each night with a level of fuss normally reserved for foreign diplomacy. One might be chosen for protection, another for fertility in case of late-night visits, and yet another to ward off snakes, both real and metaphorical. These amulets were sometimes tied to the wrist with red string, sometimes placed under the headrest, and in one recorded instance, simply held tightly in the right hand, as if the pharaoh were going to sleep, expecting a duel. Part 2, in which Alexander the Great probably didn't sleep much, but when he did, everyone had to know about it. By the time we reach the classical period, royal bedtime begins to shift, not necessarily in complexity, but in tone. Greek rulers, unlike their Egyptian counterparts, didn't go in for such overt displays of divinity at bedtime. Alexander the Great, for instance, wasn't tucked in every night with ceremonial harp music and 7 bowls of scented oils. But then again, Alexander didn't sleep like a normal person. Plutarch tells us he often slept very little, and when he did, he slept deeply, sometimes fully clothed, fully armed, and presumably still radiating conquest. Nevertheless, it would be incorrect to say there was no ritual. According to multiple sources, Alexander had the peculiar habit of sleeping with a dagger under his pillow and a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, on his bedside table. That's not a metaphor, by the way. He literally kept Homer in arm's reach, which says something about his priorities. It's not entirely clear who changed his linens, but given his fondness for Persian luxuries later in life, we can assume they were crisp, scented, and possibly changed every time someone coughed near them. The Macedonian camp routine also included the official night tent, a mobile royal bedroom with elaborate curtains and guards posted at each corner. No one was to disturb the king's sleep unless absolutely necessary, although what qualified as necessary was unclear and likely adjusted based on mood. A thunderstorm? Probably fine. A collapsing alliance? Hold that until breakfast. Interestingly, there are records of his physician, Philip of Acarnania, preparing sleeping draughts for him during campaigns. These concoctions were a mixture of herbs, wine, and possibly something that would now be classified under "do not prescribe unless under investigation." Still, it seems to have worked. On at least one occasion, Alexander allegedly slept through a siege that had his men digging tunnels under enemy walls. Either the drafts were effective, or his bed was located at a very flattering distance from the noise. There's no mention of a harpist, but one assumes if there had been one, Alexander would have insisted on silence, or conquest-themed lullabies only. The point is, even in the field, the bedtime of a great ruler was not a private affair. It was an event, attended to, recorded, possibly exaggerated, and never, under any circumstances, left to chance. Part 3, in which the Romans begin to formalize the art of bedtime fuss. As the Roman Empire expanded, so too did the seriousness with which its rulers approached the end of the day. Sleep was no longer just a matter of finding a flat surface. It became, in some quarters, a carefully managed production, one involving scribes, household staff, fragrance specialists, and occasionally a surprising number of marble walls, naturally. Emperor Augustus, for example, had a particular rhythm to his rest. He believed in short, efficient bursts of sleep, more a series of strategic pauses than a full night off. He would doze lightly between duties, often on a couch in his study, wrapped in a linen coverlet that had been warmed on a brazier and aired precisely 3 times. There was no such thing as a casual nap in the house of Augustus. Even the act of reclining had an air of bureaucratic efficiency. Later emperors developed more personal bedtime traditions. Domitian, for one, preferred to sleep in rooms lined with polished stone, not for decoration, but to ensure that nothing in the room could surprise him. Not a sudden movement, not a flickering flame, not even the swish of a curtain. The result was a bedroom that resembled a rather solemn public bath, albeit one with fewer towels and more security personnel stationed politely in the corners. Caligula, an emperor known for his colorful daytime decisions, was unusually particular about nighttime quiet. According to Roman historians, he had certain chambers in the palace sealed off, purely because he once had an unsettling dream in them. Others were redecorated, because he claimed the walls were thinking too loudly. Sleep for Caligula was a delicate arrangement, subject to mood, moonlight, and how agreeable the pillows had been that evening. Then we come to Claudius, who was said to murmur policies in his sleep. His household scribes, ever dutiful, began to record them. A few were later discovered to be utterly nonsensical. A nighttime decree involving the official classification of lentils, for example. But they were noted all the same. For a while, there was even a brief imperial rule that no one was allowed to trim their sandals before breakfast. That, too, may have been drafted during a nap. What's clear is that Roman rulers didn't just sleep, they staged sleep. There was always a system, a procedure, and a story about why the bed had to be exactly there, and not 3 feet to the left. And for the people who served them, bedtime was not an ending, but a slow, careful transition into several hours of not disturbing the emperor, while still being very nearby, just in case he required something at 2 in the morning, like a foot rub, or a clarification about barley taxes. Part 4, in which the early medieval kings bed down, sometimes with a dog, occasionally with an entire hall. In early medieval Europe, royal bedtime was a slightly more rustic affair. Gone were the polished stone walls and perfumed linens of Roman refinement. In their place timbered halls, fur blankets, and a general air of draftiness. Yet even in these simpler surroundings, kings of the early Middle Ages managed to turn sleep into a minor ceremony, one that involved layers of fabric, occasional Latin muttering, and a surprising number of onlookers. Take Charlemagne, for instance, the great Frankish king. Despite ruling over a vast swathe of Europe and reinventing half the alphabet, reportedly preferred to sleep with the windows open, even in winter. He believed fresh air was essential for health, which may explain why he often slept wearing a woolen tunic, thick socks, and occasionally a small hat, tied securely under the chin. It is unclear whether this was for warmth or simply personal flair, but either way, his bedtime silhouette would not have looked out of place at a modest barn dance. Privacy, in the modern sense, was almost entirely absent. The royal bedchamber often included not just a bed, but also various advisors, clerics, pages, the occasional pet, and possibly someone tuning a harp nearby, in case the king fancied a lullaby. In many cases, the king's bed was located in the great hall itself, on a slightly raised platform, separated by a curtain or a thoughtfully positioned wooden screen. This allowed the monarch to sleep while remaining technically available should anything pressing occur, such as a messenger arriving from Northumbria or someone misplacing the spoons. The beds themselves were sturdy wooden frames, layered with straw mattresses and topped with furs, not for luxury, but practicality. Sheep and rabbits were a common theme. There are a few records of beds stuffed with dried moss or heather, presumably by someone feeling experimental. These arrangements were surprisingly comfortable, provided you didn't mind the occasional twig or the sound of a fox rustling somewhere in the beams above you. It's worth noting that even bedtime prayers were a public act. A king might be read to from the Psalms before sleep, sometimes by a monk, sometimes by a slightly nervous clerk with a candle that dripped steadily throughout the performance. Certain monarchs were known to mumble along, while others, exhausted from long days of diplomacy, hunting, and moderately successful battle, simply nodded off mid-sermon, leaving their entourage to quietly extinguish the torches and tiptoe away. And so, while these royal knights may not have included marble chambers or silk robes, they were no less ceremonial. They just happened to be colder and smell faintly of roast meat. Part 5, in which the medieval kings begin to take bedtime very seriously, with a great deal of help. By the high Middle Ages, royal bedtime had become increasingly elaborate, not necessarily more restful, but certainly more attended. Monarchs now slept in castles, and with castles came staff, and with staff came structure. The bedtime of a king was no longer just a personal matter. It was an event, a procession even, carefully scheduled, occasionally delayed, and always witnessed. Let's begin with the ritual of disrobing, which was not, as one might hope, a swift or solitary activity. It required at least 2 attendants, sometimes more, depending on the season and how many layers the monarch had insisted on wearing that day. A good valet de chambre could remove a tunic in under 30 seconds without wrinkling it, a skill that was both admired and occasionally written about in surprisingly glowing terms. One royal wardrobe account from 1293 includes the note, "You did fold the king's undershirt with dignity and speed." Praise indeed. Once the outer garments had been removed and handed over for folding, airing, or light inspection, depending on the day, a light cleansing ritual followed. This might involve warm water, scented herbs, and a soft cloth. On some occasions, particularly in the French court, there was a designated hand-washing bowl made of silver, into which the king would dip his fingers before bed, whether they needed washing or not. It was less about hygiene, more about tradition and appearance and silver bowls. Then came the reading, not for pleasure, that came later in history, but as a devotional exercise. A monk or chaplain would be called in to read a selected passage. Sometimes this was done aloud, sometimes whispered, depending on the king's mood. There are accounts of one English monarch requesting the same passage every night for 9 months, not for religious reasons, but because he found the rhythm helped him drift off somewhere around the 4th stanza. Lighting was then dimmed, by which we mean candles were snuffed, usually one at a time, by a servant with a purpose-built extinguisher that looked like a very solemn pair of tongs. The final candle was often kept lit until the monarch gave the signal, usually a nod, though one account mentions a small bell that was rung precisely once to mark the transition from "still available" to "please don't." Finally, the king would be left with a drink. This might be warm spiced wine, or a posset, a curious blend of milk, ale, and occasionally eggs. The idea was to aid digestion and quiet the humors, though it's unclear if it ever actually did. A few monarchs preferred plain water, but even that had to be served from a jug that had been rinsed 3 times and blessed lightly by someone in robes. And with that, the room would empty, slowly, quietly, with just enough theatrical solemnity to make it clear that the day was now, at last, properly over. Part 6, in which Renaissance monarchs introduce extra steps, musical interludes, and an unusual number of slippers. The Renaissance brought with it a renewed interest in structure, style, and making everything, even sleep, a matter of aesthetic. Monarchs across Europe embraced the idea that bedtime was not simply a routine to be carried out, but a statement to be performed. It was a declaration of civility, refinement, and, in at least one case, how many people you could summon to help you change into nightwear without ever having to move your arms. Let's start in France, where King Louis XIV raised the act of going to bed to something bordering on theatre. The coucher, as it was known, became an official court ceremony. It involved nobles, physicians, and various levels of courtiers standing silently in a gilded room while the king's attendants helped him into a sleeping shirt and adjusted the covers. Not everyone was allowed to stay for all of it. There were distinct phases. High-ranking nobles might witness the initial disrobing. Lower-ranking ones had to leave before the second stocking came off. This was not improvised. It was written down. Once suitably attired for slumber, Louis would sometimes offer a few words, nothing too taxing, and sip a digestif while someone read from a devotional text or played a soft melody nearby. Music at bedtime became briefly fashionable among royals of this era, provided it was sufficiently slow, contained no abrupt chord changes, and could be played with an acceptable degree of eyelid droop. In England, bedtime retained a sense of occasion, but added layers of domestic concern. Henry VIII, for instance, required that his nightcap, a literal cap, be warmed before it touched his head. This task fell to a designated valet who would rotate 2 caps over a small brazier, alternating them with great care so the heat was even. There is no recorded punishment for unevenly warmed nightcaps, but one can assume the pressure was high. Slippers, too, became increasingly important. By the late 16th century, royal slipper presentation had been fully formalized. A designated slipper holder would place the slippers beside the bed, heel aligned, with the toes pointing slightly outward at a 45-degree angle. In one well-documented mishap in the Spanish court, a slipper was presented at the wrong angle, 15 degrees off-center, and the servant responsible was reassigned to candle counting, a less prestigious role. As bedtime neared its final moment, courtiers would file out, leaving 1 or 2 trusted attendants to remain just out of sight behind a folding screen. These attendants would remain on hand throughout the night, ready to provide water, adjust blankets, or fetch the royal physician in the event of indigestion brought on by a particularly enthusiastic posset. It was considered the height of trust to be the person quietly hovering behind a velvet curtain while the king snored. And so, in the Renaissance courts, bedtime was less an act of rest and more a closing performance gentle, elaborate, choreographed, and mostly concerned with making sure the monarch was not left unslippered, unprayed for, or underattended at any point. Part 7, in which the Georgians introduce powder, pomp, and a curious suspicion of lying down too flat. By the time we arrive at the Georgian period, roughly the 18th century, royal bedtime routines had become, if anything, even more ceremonious. This was an age of wigs, waistcoats, chamber pots with embroidered lids, and strong opinions about drafts. The monarch didn't simply retire for the night. They withdrew, often slowly, and with at least one footman carrying a candle in each hand. Let's begin with King George II, who reportedly preferred to sleep propped up on several pillows, believing, as many did at the time, that lying completely flat encouraged the vapors to settle in the lungs. The number of pillows was adjusted seasonally, and, on one occasion, according to the alignment of Venus. Whether or not this was based on medical advice remains unclear, but his valet was once reprimanded for fluffing them in the wrong order. Hair was, naturally, a major concern. Although wigs were removed at night, the royal scalp was considered far too delicate to be left unattended. Most kings and queens of the period had their heads lightly dusted with lavender powder before bed, not for hygiene, but for general morale. One courtier's diary from 1741 notes that the king appeared unusually composed this evening. His temples had been excellently dabbed. Nightwear followed strict rules. A royal nightshirt had to be freshly laundered, folded and scented, but not too scented. There was a brief scandal in the court of George III when an overzealous launderer added a few drops too many of rose oil to the collar, which clashed, apparently, with the preferred scent of the king's pillow. This was not taken lightly. The final act before sleep was the presentation of the warming pan. This was a long-handled device filled with embers, slid between the bed linens to make them slightly less frosty. The process had to be timed precisely. Too early, and the bed cooled down again. Too late, and the room filled with the faint smell of scorched linen. One royal warming pan was engraved with the phrase, "Moderation in all things," a motto that applied equally to temperature and to the length of the bedtime psalm. Reading material was permitted, but only certain types. Political treatises were discouraged, as they led to sighing. Travel accounts were considered too exciting. Suitable books included weather diaries, Greek grammars, and moral essays that concluded with everyone learning their lesson and having a quiet sit-down. If none of these were to hand, the monarch might simply request a servant to describe what happened that day, but slowly, and without involving any unresolved conflicts. With all tasks complete, the lights were dimmed, by which we mean several dozen candles were individually pinched out by a gloved hand, and the door was pulled shut behind the final bowing attendant. The room would now be left to quiet, to rest, and to the gentle sound of a monarch shuffling for a more agreeable pillow angle. Part 8, in which the Victorians add a touch of fuss, a hint of guilt, and an unreasonably long list of bedside objects. The Victorian era, ever fond of moral structure and tightly scheduled feelings, approached royal bedtime with a spirit of earnest dignity and low-level concern. Sleep was important, of course. It was when the body restored itself, the soul reflected, and the domestic staff quietly panicked over lint. For Queen Victoria herself, bedtime was a serious matter. Not dramatic, not showy, just carried out properly, with the appropriate gravity, and a carefully starched night dress. The evening would begin with a quiet meal, no spice, nothing saucy, and absolutely nothing French after 8 p.m. Once the royal stomach had been settled with a small helping of rice pudding or cold mutton, Her Majesty would retire to her private sitting room. Here she would complete correspondence, read heavily underlined devotional material, and occasionally, if the mood allowed, sketch pictures of dogs she loved. When it came time to prepare for bed, 2 ladies-in-waiting would assist with the evening routine. This included the removal of several petticoats, the brushing of hair exactly 100 times, more for order than effect, and the ceremonial placing of slippers beneath the dressing chair, toes neatly aligned, heels facing Windsor. One servant was responsible for folding the outer garments with light but decisive hands, as described in the Queen's own instructions. Bedside items were many and strictly arranged. A bell, not too loud, was placed within reach in case of emergencies or the sudden need for an extra blanket. A handkerchief, embroidered with the royal crest and lightly pressed with lavender water, was laid on the pillow. There was always a small book of evening prayers, a notepad for late thoughts, dreams, or the names of underperforming ministers, and a dish of lozenges, ideally in mint or clove, though one account mentions a brief but disastrous experiment with lemon. Queen Victoria, in later years, often requested her husband Albert's dressing gown be draped over the arm of a nearby chair, a comforting gesture, even decades after his passing. Sleep, for her, was not just rest, it was reflection, duty, and the final act of a long, controlled day. Lights were dimmed gradually, candlelight replaced by gaslight, and later electric lamps, which he reportedly did not fully trust, and the room was left to silence, apart from the gentle ticking of the clock, the faint rustle of linen, and the slow, deliberate winding down of the British Empire for the night. Part 9, in which the 20th century ushers in switches, slippers with rubber soles, and corgis who had their own schedule. With the arrival of the 20th century, royal bedtime began to modernize, slowly, cautiously, and with occasional complaints. The introduction of electricity brought new opportunities for convenience, but also fresh anxieties. Was the light truly off, or simply hiding? Would the new electric blanket misbehave? And was it still necessary to have someone stand outside the door, holding a candle just in case? King George V was a traditionalist at heart, but even he accepted certain upgrades. He permitted bedside switches, though insisted they be labelled in embossed brass. He also had his bedroom walls lined with modest floral wallpaper, and kept a framed photograph of a favourite steam engine next to the bed. A detail noted by visiting diplomats, most of whom were too polite to ask. His bedtime routine was efficient, short on fuss, and largely focused on foot-related comforts. The royal slippers were now rubber-soled for silence, and warmed beside the fireplace before use. They were handed to him using silver tongs, not for ceremony, but because one doesn't pass slippers directly to the monarch, a rule that no one could explain, but everyone followed. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, famously enjoyed a small drink before bed, usually a gin and dubonnet, always prepared to the same ratio. The glass was to be placed on a particular doily, which had been in service for nearly 30 years, and had faded to a calming, forgettable colour. Her bedtime reading tended to be reliable biographies and long-running mystery novels, which were carefully bookmarked each night, even if only a page had been read. One lady-in-waiting recalled that Her Majesty liked the sound of pages turning. It helped her settle, even if she wasn't following the plot. And then came the corgis. From the reign of George VI through to Elizabeth II, bedtime increasingly involved the presence of small, enthusiastic dogs who had their own well-rehearsed procedures. The corgis had cushions placed at the foot of the royal bed, embroidered, cleaned weekly, and their own late-night snack, a biscuit placed with quiet reverence on a small silver tray. There was once an incident involving a misplaced biscuit and a heated note sent from the Queen's private secretary. It was never spoken of again. By mid-century, the concept of a bedtime caller, someone allowed to deliver brief, non-urgent updates before lights out, was firmly established. These were usually political in nature. A minor embassy has changed hands, or the Duke of Kent is in Kent, but occasionally personal. If nothing required reporting, the Queen would be informed of that too. "There is nothing tonight, Mum," was a sentence rehearsed daily by young footmen learning the ropes. And so, even in a time of aeroplanes, radios, and rapidly approaching television sets, royal bedtime retained its familiar shape, ritual, order, comfort, and just enough gentle management to ensure that nothing, not even the turn down of a pillow, happened by accident. Part 10, in which the modern monarchy winds down with quiet precision, filtered lamps, and the occasional plug adapter. In the modern era, royal bedtime has become quieter, more streamlined, and, in a way, slightly more relatable. The rooms are still large, the sheets are still monogrammed, and the staff discreet. But gone are the days of velvet screens and heated slipper tongues. What remains is the essence of routine, a predictable, calming end to the day, with just enough protocol to remind everyone that even sleep in a palace is a shared responsibility. Queen Elizabeth II, by all accounts, was fond of routine and deeply private about the details of her bedtime. But a few gentle clues emerged over the years. She was said to retire at precisely 11 p.m., preceded by a light meal, followed by some reading, often political biographies, crosswords, or long-running detective fiction. If reading didn't appeal, she might listen to the radio at low volume, usually the BBC World Service, which has lulled monarchs and commoners alike for decades with its curiously reassuring tone. Her bedroom, it is said, contained all the expected elements: a writing desk, a telephone, a neat stack of correspondence, and a sensible armchair. Her nightwear was crisp and modest, her lamp filtered through a shade selected years earlier and never replaced. The room was often scented with a faint hint of beeswax polish, not applied by her, but noticed all the same. As for the dogs, they continued their ritual, though in later years they were more inclined to snore than parade. Technology arrived, as it always does, and had to be gently integrated into the bedtime system. The Queen was not known to use a mobile phone before sleep, but security staff ensured all devices in her vicinity were fully charged, switched to silent, and positioned so as not to create unflattering shadows. There were no alarms, no glowing digital clocks, no harsh LEDs, All lights were adjusted to evening tone, a setting achieved through a mixture of dimmers, lampshades, and knowing which bulb to never touch. The bedtime briefing remained, though it became briefer still. Toward the end of her reign, "Mom, there is nothing of note," became a cherished refrain. The sound of the world, if only briefly, behaving itself. It was said she appreciated the quiet of bedtime most of all. The knowledge that the day had ended, and that her role, constant, watching, steady, could be paused, if only for a few hours. And so, the modern royal bedtime is less theatrical than its predecessors, but no less deliberate. It is composed, considered, and politely unchanging, a tradition in soft cotton, carried out with care, behind a firmly closed door.